Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of my tutorial series on recreating this eStore home screen design in Flutter. In part 1, we created the background with the curvy effect of two containers kind of curving into each other. In part 2, we created the app bar at the top using a scaffold widget, and this is what it looks like right now for us. In part 3, we're going to create this headphone banner product section, and what's very notable about this in a subtle way is how the headphone image kind of sticks out of the background container, and that's going to be a cool little nifty effect that can kind of elevate your design a little bit. This tutorial is long overdue. I know I haven't posted in the last couple of weeks because I had a lot going on at work and I was pretty tired, but now I'm a bit more rejuvenated. I found time, took a break, and I'm back, and hopefully we can end this tutorial series by the end of the following week. The very first thing we want to do, as always, is break the design down. So let's break it down. In this design, we have a fairly simple set of components or widgets, and what we have here is essentially a background gray container with a foreground container that contains a row of two things. The first is the image itself, and then the second is the column of information about this product. So you can see over here it says new product, and then you can see that it says Headphone X1, which is the name of the product, and then finally you can see that it says buy now. And so we're going to add that buy now button, but we're going to make a slight tweak to it and not use a gradient, because if you look at the rest of the app, it's got a very nice flat, sleek effect to it. It's like a very minimal flatness, so we're going to go with a flat color instead of the gradient to contribute to that flat aesthetic. We're going to use our good friend the stack to actually organize this, and then we're going to use a row widget to organize the foreground container with the information in it. And inside of that row widget, we're going to use an image widget, and we're going to use a column widget to organize these parts. Before we continue, there are a couple of quick things I want to do in order to clean up some of the code we wrote before. This is mostly to help with organizing the code we've written in order to make it better and easier to work with going forward. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to move these constants for colors and the icon size out into a different class. And so I'm going to create a new folder called constants. And inside of this folder, I'm going to create a file called let's call it appstyle.dart. And inside of this class, I'm going to create an abstract class. Abstract here means that you cannot create a new instance of this class, but you can reference any static members on it. So I'm going to create an abstract class called appstyle, and inside of this class, I'm going to paste the style information that we had over here as constants. I'm going to make them static so that you can access them, and now that we have this set up, we have a nice centralized class that has constants that we can reference throughout our app. And don't forget to import flutter/material.dart. Cool, and now we're just going to fix the errors over here. I'm going to hit Command period on my MacBook, and we're going to import the correct file. And so I actually need to type appstyle first, and then I can hit Command period, grab the constants. And I always prefer grabbing the full package import versus just doing import constant/appstyle. It creates a more organized set of imports, plus you don't rely on relative importing, and you're relying on essentially an absolute path importing, which is important in all kinds of Dart projects. But there we go. So that looks a little better. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to move our home screen, which is this whole background thing. We're going to move that home screen widget into its own file. And so I'm going to create another folder underneath lib that's going to be called screens. And so this is essentially meant to be a folder that holds any pages or main content screens in our app. And in this app, we only have one, but for organizational purposes, and also to kind of show you how you can architect your app structure, we're going to create this folder. And inside of this folder, we're going to put homescreen.dart. We're going to paste this in, import Flutter material, and import appstyle. And there we go. And finally, we're going to import our home screen widget over here. All right, it's already looking a lot cleaner now in main.dart. Another thing I would maybe do is put this app bar widget into its own widget, but into its own widget file under a new folder called widgets, but we can leave this for now. So now that we've set all of this up, we've cleaned up the code a little bit, the next thing we want to do is we want to find an image that actually looks a lot like this. And so I found an image that's on my GitHub at github.com/aldo111/estore_flutter_app. The link is below in the description. And if you head over to my assets folder and look at headphones.png, we're going to use this image, which is pretty close. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, save image, and I'm going to drop this into my documents folder. I already downloaded it before, but I'm just doing it again for you. And what you want to do is you want to go back into your folder, your project folder, create a new folder called assets, and this is basically where our images are going to live. And so I'm just going to go ahead and create a subfolder called images, because it's always nice to be organized within the assets folder. In bigger apps, you would have a lot of different assets, and it's good to be organized here. And I'm going to open this up. Oops. I'm going to open this up in my directory, and I'm going to find that image that I just downloaded. And we're going to paste it inside of assets/images. Now, when you have an assets folder, you're going to be able to pull in those assets into your app, but you need to first declare that folder inside of your pubspec.yaml file. So if you open up your pubspec.yaml and you have like a default one, you'll see that there's already a section where you can include assets. So what we're going to do down here is we're going to add a path to that folder that contains the images. And by doing assets/images, it's going to include all images that are under that folder. So we've gotten our image and we have our structure set up. Now let's build the actual component. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder called widgets, and this is basically where our widgets are going to live. And inside of this folder, I want you to create a new file called headphone banner. You can also call this product banner to be more general if you want, but we're going to do that. I'm going to hit STL using my Visual Studio Code Flutter extension. It's going to let me create a pretty simple stateless widget out of this, and we're going to call it headphone banner. So I have this dummy headphone banner over here. I'm going to give it a color so that we can actually visualize it in the actual screen. And so I'm going to use the app style. Let's import that app style.secondary color, which should be the gray one. And let's just give it a height of about 200 for now. And I'm going to drop it into our home screen. So the correct place that we want to drop this into is going to be the child of the, as a child of the white colored section. So we're going to go ahead and put that in this container, which would also ideally be in its own widget or method. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a child here, and we're going to put this inside of, we're going to use a column widget to lay out the headphone banner in here, because there's going to be the headphone banner, and then in the next tutorial there's going to be the product section. So they're all laid out kind of vertically, as you can see. So we're going to use children. We're going to do this, and over here I'm going to add the headphone banner, as you can see, and there we go. So now we have this banner section, and if you notice in the actual picture, there are curved borders to it. So let's actually go ahead and just set that up right now. And there's also a bit of padding to the left and to the right. And we can actually apply that padding at the home screen level on the whole column, so that we don't have to keep redefining padding for every child within this column. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command period on that column, and I'm going to wrap it with a padding widget, and I'm going to set this to edge insets.symmetric. And what that lets us do is it lets us access two properties, vertical and horizontal, and we want horizontal padding on the left and right side. So I'm going to do horizontal, and I believe the padding we used was 24. Yep, that looks about right. And we're going to add a bit of padding at the top of the section, and so let's give it a vertical padding of about, let's do about maybe 16. I think that looks good. Maybe 24 actually, just keep it consistent. And there we go. And we could actually just put this inside of our app style. So we're going to create a padding field here, and I'm going to use that inside of our home screen padding. And so here we basically, now that I look at it, we're actually using horizontal and vertical, so we can just use edge insets.all and use our app style.padding. The next thing we want to do with this is we want to add a border radius to this container. And so if we go to that headphone banner, we're going to create, you guessed it, a decoration object using a box decoration class that lets us set up styling on our container. Inside of this box decoration, we're going to add the border radius, and so we use the border radius object for this using the circular constructor on it. And we're going to set this up to be about, let's see, it looks nice and smooth around here, so just eyeballing it, let's try 32 and see how that looks over here. And then it's erroring because I need to actually move the color, remember, into the box decoration. Remember, when you have a box decoration, you need to define the color inside of it instead of outside, otherwise you're going to get some nasty errors like we saw in previous videos. That's looking pretty nice. The curve is a little bit more, if you notice, in this box, so I'm going to maybe up this to about 48 and see how that looks. That might be a little too aggressive, so let's try about 36. And I think that looks a lot better. Our widget is maybe a little bit fatter than what's over here, so we can always lower the height a bit, and I think that looks a lot better, a lot closer to what we actually have here. Now, we need a model to encapsulate the product information, so we're going to go ahead and create a new folder called models, and this is basically where you'd want to put any models you define, any classes that contain information about entities you're going to be using in your application. So I'm going to create a model called product.dart. And inside this model, I'm going to create a couple of fields. And so let's see, we're going to create a title field, which will store the title or the name of the product. And so let's actually just call this name to be simple. We're going to create the field that contains the image path. And we're going to create a field that holds basically the price of the product, which for now we'll just assume is a simple integer. And then finally, we're going to create the constructor that initializes all of these fields. A very simple product model. You can modify it as you see fit. I used final as a modifier to indicate that once we initially initialize those fields with the constructor, we're not going to change them again. And so now that we've set up this model, we can actually use it as the input in the constructor for the headphone banner class. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a final field here called final product, and we're going to import the product model, and we're going to add the product to our constructor. And we are in a stateless widget, but if you're initializing the field as a final and you're not changing it, you can use extra models and variables like this even inside of your stateless widgets. So now that we have that set up, the first thing we want to do is go back here and specify that model. So how we're going to do that is, for now, we're just going to create a simple instance of the product, and we're going to give it a name. So that's the first field we need to specify, and I'm going to import this as well. There we go. The first field we need to specify is a name, and so that's going to be headphone x1. The second field we're going to specify is the image path, and so that's under assets/images/headphones.png. If you were getting this data from an API, this image path would likely be a URL, and so you would have to do things a little differently here, but you could still provide the URL in here. And then finally, we're just going to give it a price of, I don't know, 100. We're not going to use this price for now in this video, but it's there and it's set up. All right, so we've set up that product, and so now we have a product actually shown up here. So now that we've set up the model and created an instance of it with some data in it, we're going to create a stack and put the container inside of the stack, because if you look at the design, we've actually laid things out vertically. So I'm going to wrap this with, I'm just going to wrap this with a column, and then I'm going to rename this column to a stack because it has the children field that I wanted We're gonna refresh, it looks fine. And now the next thing we wanna do is we wanna start building out the foreground container that contains the image and the product information. So we can start with, just simply using a row. And because we're using a row, we can lay these things out horizontally like it is here. And inside of the row, the first thing you'll notice is the image that's over here. And so I'm going to use the image.asset file and inside image.asset class, and inside of the image.asset constructor, we're going to provide the product.image path. And we need to also make sure we specify a width and height, because that image by default is pretty big. So we're going to go ahead, specify the width, specify the height, and we likely probably have the width and height be a little bit smaller than the surrounding container, but let's just keep it at 160 for now. You'll notice it says enable to load asset with the path name in there, and that's because when you specify new assets in your pubspec.yaml, you need to actually kill and restart hot reload your application, and now you can see the image in there. And that looks pretty good. So we're going to go back to the headphone banner, and we can actually now just remove the sizing information, and you'll notice that it's actually super massive, right? And that's why we need to specify that sizing information. And so we're going to just give it a width, and the width will automatically constrain the image. And so the next thing we want to do, as we noticed before, is we want the image to kind of stick out of the container. And so the way we can do that, there are a couple of different ways we can accomplish that. So one way would be to wrap the whole stack inside of a container that has a bigger height than this container. So you could imagine that we could wrap this whole stack inside of a container that has a height of 200. And just to visualize it, I'm going to give it a color. And you'll see that we have this whole container, and then we can wrap the gray container inside of a positioned widget. And so I'm just gonna wrap it inside of a positioned widget over here. And with the positioned widget, you can absolutely position elements inside of a stack. And so we would just set the top to maybe 40. And actually, I believe we need to set the width, the left and right, to make sure that the left bound is set to 0 and the right bound is set to 0. And so that basically makes it expand from the full left to the full right. And so now if we put this at 40, it'll bring us down to the edge. And so now you can kind of see the headphone jutting out of the container. And we don't want it to be too crazy, so if we just do about 30 there, that gives it a nice clean effect. If I remove the color, you'll see that that's kind of how it looks. So that's one way of doing it, and if you do it that way, you'll notice that there's maybe too much spacing over here. And you can rectify that by going back to your home screen and reducing the padding we've applied on top of the headphone banner container. So that's over here, and we've applied app style on padding, and we could simply apply a smaller padding for the top, or not even use a padding for the top. So if we go back to using symmetric and do horizontal, and that's kind of what it looks like, and that looks a bit better. And so that's how it's set up right now. You'll notice that the headphone is maybe too high up, and there's a lot of blank space down here. So if we go back to the headphone banner, we can actually simplify this a little bit. We can maybe make the height about 200, and if we do that, you'll see that it actually becomes a little bigger. So I remove the width constraint so that it doesn't, make it a weird aspect ratio. And we've set up the image to look like that. And now we can now you can see it's already jutting out a bit. And if we do maybe 40 on this, there we go. That looks pretty good. And now that we've set that up, we can go ahead and continue building out the rest of this section. All right, so now that we've set this up, the next thing we want to do here is create the column that contains each of these things. So I'm going to go ahead and create a column widget inside of this row, and inside of this, we're going to specify 3 elements. The first element is going to be a container that wraps a text field that contains the words new product in it. So that should be fairly simple. I'm going to create a text that says new product. And we're going to wrap this inside of a container. And the reason why we need the container is to give it a good styling around the background. And so the container will have a decoration object, because if you look really closely, there is a subtle border radius to it. So we're going to use a box decoration. And inside of this box decoration, we're going to put the color, which we're going to use as, it's going to be a slightly lighter gray than what we have for our secondary color. So that's the new color we need to work with. And there's also the color of the text. So we're actually going to go ahead and do what we've done before, where we're going to try to get that color out from the image, because if you notice, we're going to need that same color in the bottom panel background. So I copy pasted the image. I'm going to open Google Chrome. We're going to go to Image Color Picker as before, and just quickly paste in the image. And here we go. I'm going to grab this this color, and that's 383838. And you guessed it, we're going to go to our app style. We're going to pick a new name for this, and we can maybe call this background gray for now, maybe. Not the best name, but I'll leave the naming up to you, and paste in 0xFF. The FF represents the alpha, or the opacity, and FF roughly translates to 255, or like the maximum opacity you can have. And then 383838 is the color hex code we need to add here. So we have that, and then we also want the new product, which if we go back here, we can grab that color as well. It's basically kind of like a faded white, and it's spelled out as ba ba ba, ba ba ba, ba ba, and we're going to call that, let's just call it caption color maybe. And we're going to give that here, and so that's ba ba ba. There we go. Cool. So we have new product, and we're going to set this up over here. So app style dot background gray is what we want to use here for this. And then we also want a very slight bit of padding around it. And so I'm going to add a edge insets padding, and we're going to use a very small value, about 4. And so you can see it's all the way up here because of the way we kind of laid out, with the container taking up about 40 pixels up here, the background invisible container. And we'll fix that in just a second. We're going to move this down a little bit, but what we're going to do here is we're going to give the text a color as well, and you need to use a text style. And inside of this text style, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to give it the color, which is going to be appstyle.caption color. And so now that you see we've done that, we're going to give it a font weight, because it looks like it has a slight boldness to it. And the font weight, we can just use font weight.bold. And now it's nice and bold. And we can go back to our decoration, apply the border radius to it. And in the border radius.circular, we can set up the border radius to be just like very slight, maybe about 8. That's way too much, so we can do half of that, 4. There we go. That looks a lot closer. And then finally, we can just decrease the size of the text style to be maybe 10. So it might be a little small. Let's see. Let's go back to 12. There we go. That looks pretty good. So we have that laid out, and what I'm going to do is back in the column we have here, I'm going to actually set up the main axis alignment, which is along the vertical axis, to be in the center. And by doing that, we're actually going to effectively move this down here and keep it centered in this whole widget, so it gives it a nice consistent effect versus you trying to position it with like absolute pixel values. All right, so we've set up the text container. That was the first thing we had to do. The next one is having a text widget to show the name of the product. Super simple. We're just going to do text product.name. And it should show up over here, but it needs to be white. So we're going to do, let's just copy paste this whole thing here. And we're going to do, we're going to use our primary white, and it's important to be consistent with the colors you're using. Otherwise, if your app has too many different colors, it can create a stylistic imbalance between different parts of it. So we have the app style.primary color, and we're going to maybe take out the, we're going to take out maybe the font size and let it be the default font size. And it should actually be a little bit bigger now that I look at it. So we're going to maybe put this up at 16. Let's see, that might be too big. Oh, that looks good. And it's not as bold, so we can actually choose specific values for the boldness. I believe font weight.bold is around 600 or 700, so we can maybe try doing 600, and that's exactly what we want. We're going to put a sized box over here. You could also simply use a padding wrapping container on the text, but we're going to put a size box here to create a little bit of spacing between the new product and Headphone X1, and I'm going to give it a height of about 16 and save that. There we go, that looks good. And then the last thing we want, maybe just reduce the height a little bit. The last thing we want to do is add the button. And so we're going to use a text button widget. Let me just add another box height here, but this time we're going to use 16 because the height difference here is a little bit bigger. And inside of this, we're going to essentially, below this, we're going to create a text button widget. And in the text button widget, we have to specify the child, which is going to be a text widget. And let's just call this by now, without the exclamation mark, to be a little bit simpler. And you can see that it also requires an onPressed function, which basically defines what happens when you press the button. And in order to style our text button, we need to actually provide a button style, which is the type of the style field. But if you actually look at the button style class, you'll see that it's taking in a lot of material state property types that wrap the actual types of the styling properties you would want to apply. So if we can actually take a look and see what that material state property class is, and it's basically a class that represents the internal material state or styling of your widget. Now, this is an implementation detail of Flutter's material framework, and we don't need to worry about that. We only simply want to style things agnostic of what kind of material state properties are being used. And so in order to do this a lot more simply, we can use the static method on the text button called styleFrom. And styleFrom lets us define things with the regular property types, and it returns a button style that we can put in here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to provide a background color, and I really like a flat color like red for this because, as I mentioned before, we want a flat color over here to keep with the whole minimal flat aesthetic of this app screen. So I'm going to use red there, and to make that text not look so disgusting, we're going to use style, text style, color, and we're going to use our primary color, which is the off-white color we have, and that looks a lot better now. If you notice, the padding is maybe a little too excessive on the top and bottom, and that's actually coming from a size property that text buttons have, where you essentially have to define the sizing constraints or the minimum sizing constraints of the button. And so what we're going to do here is we're just going to give it like a really small minimum size using the size object, which just provides a width and a height. And this will say that we just want the size to be a minimum of 5 by 5, and we want to change the padding around it to be a little bit more on the horizontal and a little bit less on the vertical. So we're going to provide padding. We're going to do edge insets.symmetric, and for vertical we'll do maybe about 4. For horizontal we'll do maybe about 12. And let's see how that starts coming out. Now, if I take out the size, the minimum size, you'll see why I added it. Even with the padding, it goes back to the original style, the original size. And so that's why we need to specify the minimum size, because if we don't, it has its own idea about what the minimum size of the button is and keeps it styled at that. So if I save it now, it'll respect my padding and use the minimum size I provided. There we go. And that actually looks pretty good so far. Maybe let's reduce the size box a bit. And I'm reducing this because the text button has its own margin as well. So we want to make sure that it's not too much. And so if I reduce this completely, we can actually probably just get rid of it. But remember that we want a little bit more space between the title and the button to let it breathe a bit. So we're going to keep it at 4. Cool. So now the next thing is to move each of these things down a little bit. And so as I mentioned, there's probably a couple of different ways to do this. We could change the axis alignment to go to the end, but that moves it a little bit too down. And so we can keep it at the center, but another thing we can do here is wrap this column inside of either a padding widget or a container widget with padding. And so if we did this and we used about 40, which is the I believe that's the difference from the top. Yeah, we can if we use about 40 as the top padding, using edge insets.only, we can basically push it down a little bit and make it perfectly centered. So let me just provide a dummy color back here using colors.orange. And so you'll see that there's about 40 logical pixels of difference here. And so by pushing it down, by giving it a padding of 40 and then using axis alignment.center, it centers it perfectly inside of the actual widget. And we can remove this. And a very final touch we might want to make is if you click the buy now, you'll notice that it has this blue ripple effect on it, and we want to change that, so we can actually use a different color for that. And I believe the property for that is called, I think it might be called primary. Yeah, I believe it's a primary. So we can actually test this by doing colors.orange. And yeah, you'll see that when you click on it, it's like a nice orange color that kind of blends in with the background. You can use any color you want. If you want it to stand out more when you tap on it, you can use something like yellow, and that actually stands out a little bit more, and it looks pretty good. In the next tutorial, we're going to go ahead and implement the product section, and we're going to end it with a very quick short video using all of the concepts we've learned to finish the special for you product section. Thank you for watching this tutorial. As always, I know the tutorial was a little longer than before, but we spent time on architecting our application, setting us up for success in the future, and using good patterns such as using models, creating good, well-constructed widgets, and covering various properties like text button, text style, using stacks again in more powerful ways to create cool little effects like these, and so on. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and do subscribe to the channel if you want to get notified about when part 4 for the product section is going to drop. Have a great day.